Hey there! Today, we'll be building a pixel art editor using only HTML, CSS, and JavaScript. Okay, so let's jump right in and take a look at what we'll be building today. So as you can see here over on the left, we have just a grid, and as we click elements down here, we can change the color of the cells that we're coloring in. So if I click black, and then I click these little cells, the cells will turn black, and if I click green, and so on. So one more additional feature that we have here is if I click the cell again rather, when I already have a color, it will reset it to basically a blank cell. So those are the basic features we have here, nothing too fancy, but let's take a look at how to build this. Okay, so if we start from scratch, let's start with our HTML. So we'll start with a div with the class of container. And then within that div, we will have another div that holds our grid. So we'll just call that grid. And then we're not actually going to fill that in with cells for now. We're just going to create the div and then we'll fill it in with cells later in JavaScript. And you'll see how that makes it much easier and more efficient, and we won't have to write every cell out ourselves. So the next thing we need, as we look over here, we have this thing down here, a palette. So we'll go ahead and create a color palette, and the color palette will be what holds all of our individual colors. So feel free to customize this kind of how you want, unless you want to just kind of follow along with the tutorial, it's totally fine. But if you want to make it your own colors, feel free to do that as well. So we have our color palette wrapper, so we need individual colors. So in this case, we're going to say data color. So we're going to create a data attribute called color, and we're going to give it our color. So let's start off with tan because that's the first color that we saw. And then we want to duplicate this for as many colors as we want. So whatever color we want, we change that data attribute to match that color. So this could also be a hex code. Basically, it just needs to be a color that CSS recognizes. So I'm, just for the sake of simplicity, going to just make it colors that actually CSS will recognize the plain word. So that's pretty much it. I have this save button, but that's not part of the core functionality, so we don't need to build that right now. We can just build kind of the basic grid we have here. Okay, so now we want to style our grid. So let's say we want container, and we basically just want this to center in the middle of the screen. So we'll go ahead and set display grid. We'll set the height to 100 viewport height units. So that will just take up the full width of the height, or sorry, the full height of the viewport. And then we'll say place items center. And what that will do is it will just place everything in the center nicely like we have here. So centered vertically and horizontally. Next, we want to style our grid. So if we go ahead and, again, not shocking, we're going to use display grid. And then we're going to set our grid template columns to we're going to go ahead and repeat 24. So we want 24 rows, and we want them, 24 columns, and we want them to take up one fractional unit each. So basically what that's saying is we want 24 cells, and we want each cell to take up an equal part of the width of the whole container. And then this is kind of arbitrary. You can set it to whatever you want. I'm just going to go ahead and set the height and width to be 500 pixels. I recommend whatever you decide on, making your height and width the same thing, just so you can have a nice square to work in. And then if you remember, we have all these cells, and each cell kind of has this like little blue background. So let's go ahead and we'll color the cell background, and we'll go and set it to 1 pixel solid. And then I'm just going to go with light blue. Feel free, again, it can be anything you want. And then we want to style that palette we had in the bottom left corner. So if I create a palette selector, we want to style this down here. So basically within our palette, we are going to go ahead and set the palette to be absolutely positioned. And then we want it to be anchored to the bottom. So we'll just set bottom 0. And then let's say, this is kind of arbitrary, but let's say we want 125 pixels from the left of the screen. And then we want, within the palette itself, we want it to use a display type of grid. We'll set the width to 250 pixels and the height to 50 pixels. Okay, so that kind of sets the outline of our palette. So let's set how our elements are going to be arranged. So we'll say grid template columns, and kind of like what we did before, we'll type repeat again, 4 and 1 FR. And then in this case, we want to style the individual kind of colors. So like we have up here, these colors within this palette. And we're going to say, we're going to use the nth child selector. So this will say like the first child, in this case, we want the background color to be tan. And you can see it appear down here. And then we'll do this with the rest of them. So we know that we want our next one to be green. So we'll set that to green, change this to a 2 instead of a 1. And then if we go ahead and do this again for the last two, so we'll say 3 and 4. And if we follow the pattern up here, it's just white and then black. So we have a tan color swatch, a green one, a white one, and a black one, and these are all within our color palette. Okay. So that's basically it for our CSS. Believe it or not, the rest of it will kind of come together with JavaScript. So we can kind of collapse this here. We'll keep our HTML just to kind of have a reference point, but most of the stuff we'll be doing will be in JavaScript. So the first thing we need to write is, before any code can run, we want to make sure that our document has actually loaded. So we're going to add an event listener to the document, and that event listener is going to be called DOM content loaded. And then after the DOM content loaded event is fired, we want, or rather when the event content loaded or DOM content loaded event is fired, we want to do something. So we'll put the rest of our code that we'll be writing will go within here. This is just so we're not like doing anything before the document has loaded. And then we want to do a few things. So first, we want to actually be able to access these elements that we've written here. So let's say colors. We're going to say document.querySelector. And basically, we want to type the name of the class that we want to target here. So we'll say, or rather, querySelector all. And we want to return color. So basically what this will do is it will return an array of elements. And each element will be whatever matches this query selector. So it's going to return tan, green, white, and black. All of these elements will be returned in an array, returned by colors. We'll come back to that later. The next thing we want to target is our grid. So I'm going to call it grid element, and I'm going to kind of copy this up here just to make it a little bit easier. And then we want to target our grid element. So in this case, we don't want to do query selector all, we just want to do query selector. So since we're using query selector instead of query selector all, it will just return one item. So if there were multiple instances of grid, it would return the first one it found. And then finally, what we want to do is we're going to create a variable called current color. And the current color, we're just going to set to black. So in this case, if we have our grid here and you haven't selected, I'm just going to refresh. I haven't selected a color yet, but I click on the grid. You can see that current color is set to black. Okay, so if we go back here, let's say, what do we want to do? So before we go any further, we need to kind of think about our approach here. So we want to, basically when you click something, we want to actually have, before that, let's actually go ahead and create our grid so we can have something on the screen. So what we're going to do is we want our grid to be a certain amount horizontally and a certain amount vertically. So we're going to make a loop, and within the loop we're going to create, let I equal 0. So we want to start at 0. And as long as I is less than, let's say we want our grid to be 24 by 24, we want to increment I. So within this loop, we want to create an element. Actually, let's call it cell. And the way we create an HTML element is with this create element function. And we want our element to be a div. once we have that element, we want to say cell.classList.add. Oops. And we want to add a class of cell. And then we need to take that element and we need to do something with it. So right now we've just created a new element, but it's an empty div. And then on this line, we've added a class cell to this empty div. And now we need to do something with it. So let's target our grid element that we created earlier. And let's say that we want to append child. So every time we append child, we're going to take the element that we're targeting. So this is the parent, and we're going to add a child element under it or within it. And let's say append child cell. Okay, cool. So just like that, we have our grid. So let's say we wanted a much smaller grid, like something like 5 by 5. Oops. Instead of 24 by 24, we only wanted 5 by 5. So you can see this basically creates 25 cells. So since up here in our CSS, we made our grid be 24, basically 24 little cell units. What it's doing here is it's saying, okay, I have 25, so I'm going to lay out 24, and they're going to be one fractional unit. And then here I am onto the next one, onto the next row, rather. And I'm going to put it on the next row. So we've got 24, all sharing the same amount of width. And then the 25th one will drop to the next one. But that's not what we want. We want to make sure that we have enough space, or rather enough cells to fill our space. So let's go ahead and change that back to 24 by 24. But just as a general word of advice, make sure that this kind of corresponds to that CSS up here. So you want to make sure that the amount of cells that you have matches the number of grid columns that you have. And that will kind of result in this nice looking grid. So in that case, we have our grid, but you click it and nothing happens. Well, that's because we need to do something with these cells. So let's say we want to target all of our cells. So const cells equals document.query selector all. And we want to target our cells again. So let's say cell. So this will return an array of cells. And what do we want to do? Well, we want to loop through our cells. So we'll say cells.forEach. And we'll say cell. And then for each cell, we want to add an event listener. And we want that event listener to be on the click event. So let's go ahead and we want to call a function. So this is a function that we haven't created yet, but basically we're saying anytime a cell is clicked, we need to do something. So in this case, the do something is like paint the cell whatever color. We will call, let's just say kind of a generic word. We'll say we want to activate the cell. And then in that case, we need to define what activate actually means. So we can put it kind of anywhere as long as it's above where we defined it. Let's say we want activate to be a function. Oops. And it doesn't need to take any parameters except for the default event that gets passed through. So when we write add event listener rather, and we pass an event here, it's not shown here, but basically what's happening is there's an invisible event that's getting passed through, and that gives us access to basically the native event that's happening when we click. So what we want is basically to color the cell. So we'll say event.target.style. So event.target gives us basically the target of the thing that we just clicked. So it gives us context to that. And we want to take, of the target, we want to target the style attribute, and within the styles rather, we want to target background color. So in this case, we want to set background color to current color. So what that will do is if I click a cell, it will assign the background color property of the cell to whatever the current color is. So if I click this, it should turn black. Great. So you'll see we already have something kind of working here. And now let's say if I click it again, like I showed in the demo, it should turn back to transparent, but that's not happening. So we need to go ahead and write the functionality for that. So let's say if event.target.style.background color. So like there's already been a color assigned to it, and the background color. So let's say if it exists and the background color does not equal transparent. Sorry, I'm just trying to use the same amount of quotes here, or the same type of quotes. I've been inconsistent in a few spots, so never mind. I'm inconsistent. Do as I say, not as I do. Use the same quotes throughout your code. And let's say, okay, so if we have basically a color has been assigned and the color that's been assigned is not equal transparent, we're going to set the color to transparent. So down here, we've said we're assigning it to the current color, but in our case here, we want to assign it to transparent. And in that case, it will basically make the cell look like we've never colored it at all. So if I click this, it goes black. If I click it again, actually, let's save this. I click it and I click it again, it's not working. So let's go ahead and take a look at why that might not be. So let's see here. If event.target.style and event.target.style, that background color is not equal to transparent, we want to, do I have a typo anywhere? Set it to transparent. So let's just check and make sure that we don't have any errors in our console. No errors. Okay, so what could be going wrong here? I'm sure it's probably obvious to you if you're watching right now. Okay, I don't think this matters at all, but let me just go ahead. This should not matter. Just as a sanity check though, just so I don't spend tons of time debugging. Okay, that didn't work. So, oh, I see what's happening here. Duh. So basically both of these are getting evaluated. So we want to make this an else. So we only want this to happen if this is not true. Okay, so that should have fixed it. If I click this, click it again, there we go. It goes transparent. Okay, so that functionality is done. So we're almost done. We just need the current color to actually mirror the swatch we have down here. So let's go ahead and write the functionality for that. So let's say const change color. We'll make a function called change color. And we want to take the event, again, referring to the click event. And we want to say update the current color variable that we defined earlier to event.target.attributes. And let's say data color this time. Okay, so basically we're targeting whatever we have here, but we need to grab the value of that, and that will give us the literal string value. And there you go. So that should update the color value that we have here, but we just have written the function. We haven't actually ran the function yet, so we need to do that. So we'll say colors. We're going to loop through all the colors, .for each color. And then for each color, we want to, we want to add an event listener. And we want that to be the click event. And when the click event is triggered, we want it to call this change color function that we have earlier. Okay, so that should be it. Let's test it out. The default color is black. If I click it, it goes to transparent. If I click tan, updates to tan. If I click green, updates to green, black, black, and so on. This white is kind of unnecessary because basically it just changes it to transparent, but you get the idea. So now we have a fully working pixel editor. So like I said, you can change the dimensions of the grid if you want. You could make the cells bigger or smaller depending on what you want. You could also go back to the CSS, and if you didn't want it to be light blue, maybe you just wanted it to be like black, you could go ahead and do that. Yeah, but it's a pretty simple little app here. I think some improvements that we could touch on later, we could actually be able to save the patterns that we've created and then basically once we've saved the patterns, we can kind of reapply them. And if we reapply them, we can reapply them kind of in sequences. So that opens up the possibilities for animations. But this is just part one. Just wanted to show you how to make a very basic pixel editor. All right, so that kind of wraps it up. If you like this video, please go ahead and subscribe for more videos like it. And thank you for watching.